Okay, in this video we're going to look at section 3 of chapter 1. Marx starts out noting that while a commodity exists, you cannot assess its value objectively by studying it. You can't take it into a lab, you can't, weigh it for its value. He says, not an atom of matter exists in the commodities as values, and commodities only have value insofar as they are concrete representations of human labor. So value is a social relation, and it only manifests when we compare different commodities. I may not be able to say specifically how much a rubber band is, or how much value a rubber band has, but I know it has less value than a car. And it's by comparing commodities like that that we can kind of begin to assess out their relative values. So Marx then spends about 20 pages kind of tediously going through when society frequently barters and exchanges commodities, a single commodity ends up being a universal exchange commodity. We'll go through it briefly here. Basically, you can express the values of commodities in terms of other commodities, like we described before. You might say 10 grapes are worth an apple, etc. Generally, you can say X commodity A is equal to Y commodity B, which is equal to Z commodity C, and so on. We can then expand this to consider all commodities. The example Marx gives is that 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or one quarter of corn, 2 ounces of gold, half a ton of iron, and so on. Marx calls this the general form of the value. Going further, we might set aside a commodity that is particularly useful for just exchange, namely a commodity that you don't really have a lot of use for. That prior example can be reordered in terms of 2 ounces of gold equals 20 yards of linen, 1 coat, 10 pounds of tea, 40 pounds of coffee, 1 quarter of corn, half a ton of iron, etc. Marx calls this the money form. The simple expression between the relative value of a single commodity, such as linen, in a commodity which is already functioning as a money commodity, such as gold, is the price form, like 20 yards of linen equals 2 ounces of gold. With this universal exchange commodity, we see a contradiction arise in that the use value appears as a stand-in for value. Let's say we made a hypothetical society where dog treats were the universal exchange commodity, what we're using for money. Dog treats have a certain use, but in this society we're using them to represent value. Your coat might be worth 150 dog treats, for example. Since this universal exchange commodity has been endowed with these characteristics that are very different from its material nature, it conceals the social relations that went into it. That means you don't see the dog treats as the product of human labor, but as the embodiments of value, a representation or expression of value. Just like today, when we think of gold, we know that human labor went in to produce it and to mine it out of the ground and make it useful to us, and granted more so in the past, gold was seen as the representation of value, of wealth. So we see a commodity, which is a concrete, objectified bit of human labor, acting as a stand-in for an abstract human labor or value. Finally, Marx points out that Aristotle noticed in his observation of commodity exchange that there was some equivalency going on that allowed for commodities to be exchangeable. There must be something common to commodities that allows you to compare them. But Aristotle failed to understand that the equivalency is that human labor went into them. This is the result of the social conditions of his day. There wasn't this sort of like capitalist commodity production back then. There was slave labor. Nobody really concerned themselves where value comes from. You know, you just had slaves who worked because they were forced to. So this really prevented Aristotle from understanding the reality of commodity exchange. And this really drives in an important point about how social conditions shape ideology. Contrary to the idealist notion that the material world is an emanation of ideas put in practice, Marx argues the other way around. The material world is conceived of by humans, and that's what gives us our ideologies and conceptions of reality. So, and not to get theological, but it kind of irks me a little bit when some people claim that Jesus was a socialist because of some of the teachings that are promoted in the New Testament, for example. Certainly those teachings are very much in favor of the poor, the downtrodden, and so on. But Jesus could not have understood capitalism, commodity production, and capitalism, the concepts of private property, and so on. We have to remember that, you know, feudalism didn't really exist in the form that we know it today until starting around, I guess you could say the first seeds of it were planted by Diocletian in the 3rd century. So this idea that Jesus was a socialist or a communist or even a Marxist, I think it conflates meaning well and being a good person with having a scientific analysis of commodity production and the sort of class consciousness that would be needed to be interested in promoting, you know, a system that abolished private property. And I don't think it's reasonable to claim that that could have existed in the 1st century.